All right. So, right now we are going to learn about the characteristics of life. So, all living things actually share similar characteristics or traits. And so, we want to take a look at what those are. There are 8 of them. Now, if you were to search for this, you might see 10, you might see 8, but I'm going to teach you 8 different characteristics that all living things have. Here they are. So write these down, please. Pause the video if you need to. All living things share in that they are made of cells. They reproduce. They perform metabolism or chemical reactions. They have homeostasis. They inherit or have DNA. They respond to stimulus. They grow and develop, and they evolve or show adaptation. Okay, hopefully you've written all of those down. So let's look at cells. Cells are considered the basic unit of life. The basic unit of life. It's the smallest unit of life. We can have single-celled organisms or we can have multicellular organisms. For example, right here on this needle, we can see all these little red discs. Those are red blood cells, and this is an electron microscope scan. Each one of these cells is a living unit of life. This plant tissue right here, each one of these boxes or little rectangle-y shapes is a cell. So a single-celled organism might be something like an amoeba or a bacterium. Multicellular organisms have 2 or more cells to make them. For example, I am a multicellular organism, as are trees, as is grass, as are lions, and so on. Even this hydra is a multicellular organism, even though it's not as complex as a human being. Now, typically, we see an organization of living things. So they all have the same basic organization, especially multicellular organisms. We start with cells, tissue, organs, organ systems, and organisms. Now, you might even be able to go to a smaller level, like atoms first, then molecules, then organelles, then cells, tissue, organ system, organisms. But we start with living things at cells. Okay. All living things show the ability to reproduce. So they create offspring. Now, this can be done 2 ways. You can have sexual reproduction, which uses eggs and sperm. Now, often I get this question. I am not talking about intercourse here. I'm talking about sexually, meaning that there is an egg and sperm involved, not intercourse. So if I ask you, for example, do trees reproduce sexually or asexually? Sexually. Pollen is tree sperm. So they reproduce sexually through an egg and sperm. Now, asexual reproduction is one parent, and there can be a variety of ways that can happen. You can have fragmentation. You can have binary fission in bacteria where you have 1 and it becomes 2. You can have parthenogenesis, like certain organisms that can produce both male and female parts. So this can happen in a variety of ways, but every living thing reproduces. Okay, metabolism. This is all the chemical reactions in an organism. So not just eating. Eating is a form of metabolism, but metabolism refers to all the chemical reactions. For example, photosynthesis would be a part of metabolism. It's a chemical reaction performed inside plants. You could also say cellular respiration, any kind of hormonal chemical reactions in the organism would be part of metabolism. Homeostasis. All living things have homeostasis. Homeo means same, stasis means stable. So this is where an organism is maintaining a stable internal environment, stable, stasis. Balance between the cells and their external environment. Cells sometimes float around in extracellular fluid. And so that cell needs to create balance between its inside and what's on the outside. Shivering is an example of this. If I go outside in the freezing cold, my body temperature starts to go down. And so my body starts to shiver in an effort to raise the temperature of my body. We see this also with glucose levels. Glucose is a sugar, a type of sugar. So our body, if we eat a bunch of candy, and you know I like my sugar, eat a bunch of sugar and candy, my body will release insulin in order to get that sugar out of my blood and into my cells in order to maintain even, stable levels of glucose. Okay. Heredity or DNA. This is the ability of traits to be passed on to offspring. All living things on planet Earth have DNA. It's actually pretty amazing to think about. Every cell, minus a few, contain DNA. And DNA is this structure, this molecule that keeps track of our genetics. And so if you look at this picture of Michael Jackson and his family here, there's a lot of stuff about them that looks the same. Their noses, their skin color, their hair texture and color. All of these things are because that was inherited from their parents and from their parents and from their parents. Now, DNA is that code that then makes proteins that then physically makes the body. Okay, all living things respond to stimulus. This is an involuntary reaction, responding. For example, if you were to go be cooking something and you open up the oven and you just grab the cookie sheet with your bare hands, you're probably gonna drop it. That's an involuntary response. You just responded to the heat, the pain of that hot pan. We see this in plants. If you look at this picture, these plants are leaning towards the sun. They're responding to the sunlight shining in on where they are, trying to get more of that sun. So response to stimulus. Okay, now, number 7, all living things grow and develop. Growing is increasing in mass. So physically getting bigger. We can assume that one of you, when you were a baby, you are not still a baby 14 years later. You have grown physically bigger. Developing is changing in ability and maturing. So we would expect that a baby, when they're first born, all they can do is cry and sleep and poop and eat. But then as they get older, they can start to sit up, they can start to crawl, they can walk. So they're adding abilities. So growth and development happens in an individual. In an individual, we see growth and development. It can happen in a living thing like a chicken. It can also happen in a living thing like a tree. Okay, the last characteristic of life that we see in all living things is the ability to adapt to their environment, or we would call that evolution or evolving. This is change over time in a species. Hear that, please. Evolving or adapting happens in a species when we're talking about science. This does not happen in an individual. You wouldn't see a brown fox move to the... Sorry about that. You wouldn't see a brown fox move to the snowy places and then suddenly turn like white when it was never white before. So this happens over time. Maybe you'd have a fox that moves to the white area and has some babies, and some of the babies have a little bit whiter fur than normal. And those babies can hide better And so then they can have more offspring and they pass on the trait for lighter fur. Now their babies, the grandbabies, have whiter fur, and so on and so on and so on. So the species evolves over time. This is natural selection, descent with modification. You can see in this picture, here was a megalodon in red. This is an ancient big shark, and over millions and millions of years, it has evolved to become smaller to a great white shark size, which is still really huge, but not nearly as big as a megalodon. Okay, you guys, last thing, there is a hierarchy of organization within multicellular organisms, which I mentioned. You go cell, tissue, organ, organ system, organism. Cell is the simplest, organism is the most complex. This is how multicellular organisms are organized. I'm going to skip through this. Simple to complex, simple to complex. All right, excellent job. Thank you.